Hello and welcome to Literary Notes, a podcast by the Washington Talking Book and Braille Library. I'm your producer, Nathan Ureta, and in this episode, we talk to Mike Gastineau about his latest book, Fear No Man, on Don James, the 91 Huskies, and the 7-year quest for a national football championship. Mike Gastineau is a broadcaster, writer, and Seattle sports legend, heading a show at KJR Radio in Seattle for 21 years, from 1991 to 2012. Fear No Man is his 5th published book, and it tells the story of the Washington Huskies' unforgettable 1991 football season, in which the team went undefeated and won the coach's National Football Championship. This interview was conducted by Bob Carlson, a volunteer at the Washington Talking Book and Braille Library. He also narrated the book for our collection. I gotta say, as someone who grew up in the Puget Sound of the 90s, it was a real treat to be there for this interview. Mike's voice was a mainstay in our household, and it was really cool to have him in our studios. So without further ado, here's their conversation. Enjoy.
My name is Bob Carlson. Some of our listeners may be aware that I'm a volunteer audiobook narrator here at the Washington Talking Book and Braille Library. I recently had the privilege of recording Fear No Man, Don James, the 91 Huskies, and the 7-year quest for a national football championship. And today I have the honor of welcoming the author of Fear No Man, Mike Gastineau, to the program. Mike, welcome.
Bob, thank you. Thanks for having me. And this is a lot of neat things happen to you when you do books, and this is one of the neatest, for lack of a better word. It's great to be here, and it's fun to think that my book now is a part of the the library down here.
Well, that's true, and in fact, it's been now that it's been recorded, it's ready for upload to the National Library Service for the Blind and Print Disabled. So it will gain a national audience in audiobook format. Our listeners, I think, are probably familiar with our Seattle listeners, at least, are certainly familiar with your name and your voice from your days as a broadcast sports journalist. But I wonder if you could just give us a short summary of kind of your resume.
Sure. I when I was one of the lucky people. When I was a little kid, I knew what I wanted to do. I loved the radio, and I loved two things about the radio. I loved listening to music, and I loved listening to sports. And I, like 7 or 8 years old, I would tell people, "No, I'm going to be a radio broadcaster," and it happened. So it was really. I feel fortunate for that, because you meet people who take a long time to find what their passion is, and some never do. I knew when I was a kid I could see myself doing things like this. So I, went to college, went to Indiana University, graduated in '82, worked in Montana, Nebraska, Virginia, and then moved to Seattle in '91. Always working in radio, but always writing too. I loved writing. I hadn't done a book, but I'd done a magazine article and a newspaper article here and there, and I loved I loved putting that kind of thing together. So I get here in '91, and the sports talk radio thing is happening around the country, and it's happening here, and it was just such a great time. And we had a good staff of people, and I was there in various capacities at KJR from '91 until 2012.
Yes.
And in 2012, I just kind of had reached a point where I joked, and I wasn't really joking. I had a little voice inside of my head that kept saying, "Shut up, they've already heard that story." I really kind of felt like, I think I may have said everything I have to say. And I didn't leave radio to become an author, although I've done 4 books now. I wasn't sure what I was going to do. I wasn't sure what would present itself, but I had the opportunity. My wife and I had been, my wife, really, I have nothing to do with the money, because it would all be gone if I did. But we'd put ourselves in a good position where I could take a little time and see what I wanted to do.
That's great.
And what it was I wanted to write books and kind of share my love of sports history and the knowledge I had about it. And so that's how we end up here. I joke that, when I was in sports radio, and still to this day, there are lots of people who get into radio who were writers. And they get into radio because, I'll be very honest, it's easier, it pays better, and it's easier. So I'm the only guy who said, okay, I got this nice, easy, well-paying job, but I'm going to show you, I'm going to leave that and become a writer and scrap for every nickel I get. But I've really enjoyed it. And as much as I love radio, and I'm proud of what I've done there, and I mean, something else might happen eventually, I don't foresee that, I love the, you've got the book sitting there. I love the idea of, this book didn't exist a few years ago.
Right.
And now it does, and I'm the reason for that, and that gives me tremendous satisfaction to do that.
Well, it's a terrific book. It's a great read, and I enjoyed it very much. You'd mentioned that you arrived here in Seattle in 1991, and that you and I have that in common. I moved up here from Colorado in the summer of 1991, and so I got to experience the Huskies' 1991 season kind of through the eyes of friends that I'd made who were UW alums and Husky fans. And I wondered if you arrived at about the same time. What was your experience of the Huskies' 1991 championship season?
They were the thing in town. They were the ticket. They were the story. There was nothing else going on. The Seahawks were in a down period. The Mariners had not had anything close to success yet. The Sonics were in a down period, but getting ready to take off. They were on the runway, getting ready to roll.
Right.
But the Huskies were, considered one of the top programs in the country. And that's kind of what I remember is just, I didn't even know, we got here in June, my wife and I, and we weren't even married yet. And I didn't know, I didn't know what was going on.
Yeah.
You're you're drinking from a fire hose, so many new things are coming. But I knew this was a great team. I could tell it was a great team. They reminded me of a team from my youth growing up in Indiana, the 1976 Indiana basketball teams, the last unbeaten team in NCAA history.
Oh,
they were 32-0. They were a sensational team. Indiana fans will tell you they should have won the year before and got a very tough break late in the season. They were 29-1 that year.
Yeah.
This team reminded me of that. They just overwhelmed opponents. And you could tell, it's fun. History always gives you that lens to look back. But occasionally a team comes along where you're living it, like watching this team.
Yes.
Hey, this is one of the greatest teams we're ever going to see. You knew it. You didn't need the benefit of history to know that.
I had the same experience, and I kind of had the same reaction during that year. It was really something special to be able to observe. Mm-hmm. But, as you point out, I think in the book, and as the title suggests, it didn't come about overnight. You talked about there's a 7-year quest for the National Football Championship. Maybe you can give us sort of an introduction to how the book got made and how you went about starting to tell that story.
Well, and the 7-year part kind of came to me after I'd gotten started, but it did as you talk to people. And I remember, I knew Don James very well. I wish he had been here, when I had this idea and did this book. But there's still so many people who knew him, and I was able to do, I think, a pretty good job of painting a complete picture of who he was and what it meant to him. And Carol James was invaluable in helping me put this together. And I talked to her.
I think.
Yeah, I talked to her about the '84 Orange Bowl.
Right.
Because the '84 team, those guys will tell you we were the national champs, and it was back in the voting day. Well, this was in the voting days, but I mean, BYU ends up getting it, and that was just it sticks in the collective craw of that '84 team. And I started looking into it, and I talked to Carol, and she says, "Yeah," she goes, "That was Don was not a guy who would walk around, wallowing in his disappointment." But she admitted to me, she says, that was one that really got him. He thought for sure they would win. There was the writers' poll and the coaches' poll, and he thought, well, one of them will recognize what we did.
Yeah.
Neither of them did. And Don had told me, he says, it wasn't like I was obsessed with winning a national title, but it would be nice. And I think he's probably more obsessed than he would have let on. You get to a point where, okay, you want to win 10 national titles, but you want to win one. You want to get that one.
You want to have that on the wall.
And
absolutely.
It bugged him that the '84 team didn't get it. And then his program went into a dip, and we go into that a little bit. It declined for a few years, and there's a couple of pivotal points in the book where he makes decisions on how they're going to recruit from this point forward. He makes a decision to change his offense. He makes a decision to change his defense. Don James was thought of as this fence post in the ground. He's going to do it his way.
Yes.
Nothing, this is it. And what I tried to do in this book was explain Don was so good, he was willing to change just about everything about how he approached things as he saw better paths come forward.
Yes.
It's a great lesson for all of us because, again, if you talk to people about Don, they would think, oh, yeah, he did it his way. Don changed a lot, and because he changed, he was able to put this 91 team together and win the championship because he was open. You got to be open to new experiences, right?
Right.
Don was way more open to new experiences than people would have realized, and I think that comes through in the book.
Well, you mentioned just now recruiting, offense, and defense, and it does come through in the book. Each of those three things are a theme, and maybe we can explore those one at a time. Start with recruiting. What changed in that 84 to 91 period about recruiting at UW?
The biggest thing he did was to hire a recruiting coordinator for the most part. They didn't call him that. Dick Baird was an assistant coach.
Right.
Dick's just one of the greatest characters in Seattle sports history, and just a delightful guy, and visiting with him for this book was really fun.
Yeah.
And when he approached Don, Dick was a community college coach. He had a good reputation around town as putting out good teams and good kids, but he was also, I forget the exact age, he's in his mid-30s. And he goes to Don and meets him and says, I want to be a graduate assistant.
Yeah.
And graduate assistants didn't make any money. They lived in the same house together eating mac and cheese and tuna.
Exactly.
And Don's like, you got a wife and kids.
Yeah.
I can't pay you any. I mean, they paid like a stipend was all, and he had to take some class. But this was one of the neat connections that I didn't realize existed. Don wasn't 100% sure. He's like, I think this guy could help us, and he hadn't even thought of him yet as a recruiting guy until he talked to a guy. There were only a handful of people in the mid-'80s or early 80s who Don would have thought of as a peer worthy of my respect in the Seattle area.
Yeah.
And of all people, he talked to Lenny Wilkins, who was a championship coach.
Yeah.
And Lenny said, listen, Dick Baird has run my basketball camp for I think 4 or 5 years, and it's unbelievable how well I've never seen a guy who connects with kids better and who gets work out of them. And that, Wilkins' opinion held sway with Don, and Don decided to bring Dick in, and Dick spent the 84 season that ended in the Rose Bowl, I guess the 83 season that ended in the Rose Bowl, as a graduate assistant, and then there's a picture of them.
There's a picture in the book in front of the Rose Bowl,
the Orange
Bowl down in Miami with Don and Dick Baird.
Yeah.
And they both look pretty young, but Dick looks especially young.
And as that picture's being taken, Dick told me Don was offering him a job.
That's what you said in the book.
He says, I don't know what it's going to be, but I want you here full time next year. And that was, and Dick came in and just streamlined I think he was the wide receivers coach, but he said, I was helping with that. He goes, I tried to help as much as I could coaching, but I knew why I was here. I was here to help us streamline how we looked at players. Things were changing. There was much more video. There was technology, like a VCR that, I think Dick said the first day, he's like, we've got one VCR. He goes, every coach needs a VCR. We all have to have, it's like 1983 or 84.
Sure.
And so he brought and again, Don was open to this and saw where it could benefit him. So the recruiting thing really owes to Dick. And Don was the head coach. Don was the CEO. Don was the guy the kids had to impress. Right. Dick was the guy who legitimately listened to the kids' music and knew the kids' culture.
Yeah.
Knew how to tease them and relate to them as an adult figure, but also as somebody who, was just maybe a little closer to the young players than Don was in terms of attitude. And that really helped as they started bringing people in that were going to help change this thing.
Excellent. Yeah. So recruiting is the first leg. You mentioned defense, and one of the chapters in your book is titled something like, we got to get Gilby.
Yeah. Well, and that'd be the offense was Gilby.
Oh, I beg your pardon.
Which is fine. Yeah. Gilby and Lambeau are the same guy, it feels like, except Lambeau was much more cut in the mold of Don, and Gilby was much more cut in the mold of Dick Baird. Gilby was loose and funny and quick with a joke. And so I'll go with the Lambeau piece first. The defense was, Jim Lambright, from the time he had been here, was always telling Don, we got to blitz more. We got to attack more. Jim wanted to blitz the Coke machine in the office if he thought they could tackle it. He wanted to do constant blitzing.
Yeah.
And Don was like, you play conservative. You make the other team make a mistake. You win the punting game. You win the field position game, and then you win the game. And as the athletes they were getting at UW started improving, and they started getting these really fast guys, and other teams had really fast guys, and Jim kept saying, you know, we need to loosen our defense. And I think it was the middle of the '89 season where he finally convinced Don. They had a game against Arizona State, and they didn't play well, and he convinced Don afterwards. He says, our guys are thinking too much.
Yeah.
We got to just tell them, just go.
Cut them loose.
And they did that, and the turnaround was dramatic and immediate, and it unleashed a 3 or 4 year run of defense that's never been duplicated at UW, of just phenomenal play. And again, just the idea that it wasn't freelance. You know, a guy couldn't go on his own, but basically they put in defenses where the trick for the offense was to guess which guy was coming.
Yes.
And they disguise it. They did a great job of it, and he was just a masterful teacher. Jim Lambright was a chess player, and he used to have a chessboard in his office. And I think he viewed this as kind of speed chess. You know, we're going to put guys where we don't normally put them. We're going to make you think the guy that's really fast is coming when it's the guy who maybe is a step slower coming. You think a guy's coming from the left. We're sending a guy from the right. But the key was any one of the 11 guys could come after the quarterback on any play.
At any time.
And just the way they attacked that, and the way they just, I don't know if he was the first to do this, but he's among the first to come up with the half tackle statistic. In other words, if you tackle a guy, you're bringing a guy down, and I come and finish him off, I get half a tackle. And he did that just to create excitement and competition among the guys. And then the other thing he told his defense is, after every play, I want every one on the defense to run to the guy who made the tackle and celebrate.
Yeah.
And just create this us against you mentality. And he did a great job with that, of just building. You know, what's funny is James Clifford, who was a huge part of his defense, was going into Lambright's office the morning after the Arizona State game to tell him, Coach, we're thinking too much. We're not reacting anymore. And he starts to talk, and Lambright put his hand up and said, Jim, it's taken care of.
Taken care of. I remember that
worry.
in the book.
It's
Absolutely.
taken care of.
Yeah.
And then that afternoon is when they put it in. And Gilby, there's a funny story. Gilby, like, looking over. The first time they scrimmaged after they had this discussion, Gilby says, What is
have
this?
You done? Yeah.
What have you done? Yeah, because Gilby's got this space-age offense, and then they suddenly had a space-age defense to go with it. So, Lambeau is one of the things I wanted to do with the book was make sure we reiterate how important particularly Gilby and Lambeau were to the success of UW on the field, and Dick Baird too. But and the whole coaching staff. It was really a great coaching staff.
Yes.
But these two in particular, Lambeau was basically putting in elements of the Bears defense that had won the Super Bowl in '85, and Gilby was running crazy stuff like 4 wide receivers in the pattern that he had learned from Dennis Erickson, who had learned it from Jack Elway, John's dad, down in at San Jose State. And Jack had coached it in high school in Southern California. So all of this stuff, again, Don was open to those changes, and it really dramatically changed what UW was thought of as a program.
Oh, it absolutely did. One of the anecdotes I remember from the book, and I can't remember who was saying it, it might have been James Clifford, was talking about we'd be getting to the quarterback within a couple of seconds, within steps. Mm-hmm. And so we didn't really have to care too much about what was going on with the receivers downfield,
right?
Because he wasn't going to be able to find him.
Right,
yeah.
Right. That was a big, because they oftentimes put their corners or safety on an island. They go, you're in one-on-one coverage. But the good news is you only have to cover him for about 3.5 seconds, because that's all the time the quarterback. And
that's all he's got.
It wasn't every single play, obviously,
sure.
But they just were able to wreak havoc with the pressure up front and just overwhelm teams that were really good at passing the football.
Yeah, big component of that victory. I was intending to move into defense earlier when I talked about Gilby, but you said, okay, what about the offensive step? We got to get Gilby. What's that chapter about?
Well, and that's again, a key person to this is Gary Pinkel. Gary Pinkel, who goes on to become the winningest head football coach at Toledo and the winningest head football coach at Missouri. And I think it's Steve Spurrier is the only other guy who's done that. Maybe there's one other guy, but to be the winningest coach at two different schools. Gary Pinkel, it's kind of ridiculous that UW never looked to hire him, to be perfectly honest. But at the time, Gary's the offensive coordinator. And he also was recruiting Eastern Washington for UW. And so he would drop in at Idaho. Everybody wanted to see Dennis Erickson because Dennis Erickson in 1983 at Idaho was running quads left and quads right. He'd line up all four receivers on the left side of the. Nobody was doing that. It looked ridiculous, but it worked.
It worked.
And so the coaches, I want to go see what these guys are doing. It works in the big sky. Would it work anywhere else? And Pinkel's looking at this and just, really impressed with what they're doing. And by now, Erickson has left and Gilby's now the head coach at Idaho. And the Huskies offense is sputtering. They're sputtering under the Don James way, which is you got a fullback, you got a tailback. Again, you don't pass the ball very often. It's Midwestern football. It's Massillon, Ohio football.
There you go.
And it worked for a lot of years. It worked forever. But it was starting to not work.
Yeah.
And of all things, your offensive coordinator, Gary Pinkel, goes to the head coach and says, we've got to get Gilby over here.
Yeah.
Because his offense is incredible. We've got to get him. We can't just take his offense. We need him.
Yeah.
And Gilby had worked for Don as a grad assistant for a year, so Don knew of him. So here's the offensive coordinator saying, let's bring in an offensive guy. And Gilby at the time was the head coach at Idaho and was in the running for the coaching job at Texas El Paso, but he didn't want that. He said, I'm not a Texas guy. I don't really know how to recruit down there.
Yeah.
But he was happy at Idaho, and he figures his next step will be to be a head coach at a bigger school.
Yeah.
Don offers him the offensive line job, and it says, but we're going to put your offense in. And so Gilby took it because he saw what was building. And Gilby's great line is, and Pinkel was so selfless about this. Gilby says, I don't care what you call me. I want the chalk. He wanted to diagram the play. He wanted to run the offense.
Yeah.
And he and Gary did a nice job of working with each other. But that, Gilby's offense and UW's offense that really was incredible comes together because Gary Pinkel was secure enough in who he was to say, I need help. We need help. And this is the guy we need to help us.
Yeah.
And that's a neat story of how that came together. And Gary talked about it. He'd go over and spend like hours in the Idaho film room when he's supposed to be recruiting kids, just going, like slack-jawed, watching this crazy offense zing up and down the field. He says, God, I think that would work in the Pac-10. I think that would work over there.
Yeah. Well, those guys saw that, but it wasn't without some criticism. I mean, I recall some things in your book about some of the sports writers at the time were saying, well, this is fine for a Big Sky offense,
right.
but is that going to work in the Pac-10?
Right, and not even the writers as much as fellow assistants.
Yeah.
There's guys telling them, hey, it's never gonna, you're never gonna make that fly here. And again, Don was smart. And he saw with Gilby immediately, he says, okay, I see what you're saying. I see how this can work. He didn't completely buy into it right away. It was a gradual shift, but he's like, yeah. And Pinkel and Gilby, everybody's telling him. And again, Don was a smart guy. This is how the game's going. And Don knew this. He's watching other teams going,
sure.
I can see how we're moving away from 3 yards in a cloud of dust.
Yeah.
We're moving into an era where, and I mean, shoot, what we're seeing now makes Washington look positively conservative. But Washington is, if not the genesis of today's crazy offense in college football, it's one of them. It's one of the pillars. It was
right.
one of the first big schools where people said, let's try it this way, and let's put a bunch of receivers in the pattern, and let's get quarterbacks who can think through progressions and all that. And I mean, they'd been doing that before, obviously, but very rarely did a quarterback have this many options. And again, and then the big key, you always have to come back to this, and I can hear Don admonishing me from the great beyond, was the players. The players bought into it, and the players had the talent. The smartest coach in the world is going to go 5-7 if he's got lousy players. Comes down to the horse. Do you have the horses to win the race? And they did.
Well, that's a good segue into the next topic that I wanted to ask you about, because we talked about changes to the coaching staff and some of the changes that Don James was open to, but you're right. I mean, at this time, some players were coming up in the Huskies ranks, And that made a big difference.
Yeah, it did. They did such a great job recruiting. And again, it was partially because with Don working with Dick Baird, they put in a very Don James-esque system. It would be streamlined. It would be here's the thing. They stopped, and I thought this was an interesting story. I'd never thought about this. And I remember Don telling me this when we did a radio show together. They stopped trusting high school coaches to give them accurate 40 times because a high school coach wants his kid recruited.
Sure.
And they knew the exact time they had to say. Bob Carlson, he can run a 4.4. And they get Bob Carlson in and he runs a 4.7. And like, wow.
If that. Yeah.
You're right. So, he said, we need our watch on. We need a track and field. If a guy's at track, you get the track and field time. See, make sure that's accurate. We need, they had a whole, like a recruiting packet we're going to send to the kid. We want to know his parents. They really streamlined, and so they made fewer mistakes in recruiting. And, the one of my favorite stories about that is, despite that, and despite Don being, he was like, here's how we're going to do it. There's a story of Sid Otten, who's a great legendary coach down at Tumwater for years. And he and Don knew each other very well. And Randy Hart, another terrific assistant coach, is in Sid Otten's office recruiting somebody. Sid says, there's a tight end out in Aberdeen you guys ought to go look at because he'd really help what you're doing now. And they knew they were changing. His name's Mark Bruner. Go look at him. So Randy comes back to Seattle. And Don comes and says, how the visit with Sid goes. He goes, well, really well. And he says, what are you doing? He goes, I'm putting together a recruiting packet. Well, for Sid's player, we already did that. He goes, no, I'm putting together one. There's a kid out in Aberdeen that Sid says we should look at. And Don looks at him and says, offer him a scholarship. And Randy goes, look, we've got the system, coach. You see, he goes, if Sid Otten says he'll help us, he'll help us.
That's something, yeah.
That has a neat story. And Mark Bruner, becomes one of the most famous Huskies in history. And
No
has
doubt.
a great NFL career. And his son is now a key part of last year's Huskies and this year's Huskies. So again, the brilliance of Don. We're going to have a system. We're going to do this. But Sid Otten says somebody's good enough. We don't need to worry about our system.
He's not hidebound to the system.
Right. Yeah. That's a great way of putting it. He was willing to go that way. But they were just able to get guys, and I mean, Empman, we haven't even mentioned Steve yet, and he's the bell cow, really, of who they got to come in here.
And let's just say we got the book in front of us here. There's a great color photograph, and there's a famous photograph of Steve Empman celebrating after a tackle. It's kind of the centerpiece of the 91 season in a way.
I think so. That's the first Husky game I ever went to, and I remember that play. That's it's the second play of the game for Arizona.
Yes.
George Mala'ulu is the quarterback. George Mala'ulu was ambidextrous. He could throw with either hand. It didn't help him this day, and he was not a bad quarterback, but it wasn't going to help him.
And there he is on the ground, number 12 on the ground, and Empman is dancing over, doing the war dance over him.
Yeah, he's Steve was so keyed up for that game, and we talked about Randy Hart played a game with him all week about the Arizona guys are you're gonna stink in this game. Randy was great at pushing guys' buttons.
Yeah,
and he just had Empman wound up, and Empman. I just remember the first three. Washington gets the football at the start of that game, and they go 3 and out. They punt to Arizona. Arizona's return guy gets to the 48-yard line. That's the only time all day they'd be in Husky territory. On the first play of the game, Empman comes blasting through the line and flattens Mala'ulu. And I remember this. I see it in my mind's eye. So your memory gets tougher as you get older. This, I still have that reel going in my mind.
Yeah.
Now it's second down, and Empman comes blasting through the line again and floors Mala'ulu. And that's when that picture was taken. He pops up after both plays, but he pops up after the second play and throws his index fingers in the air. And a guy named Mark Harrison, late Mark Harrison of the Seattle Times, got that photo. I think it's one of the greatest photos I've ever seen.
It's iconic.
And third down, Arizona breaks the huddle. And I in my mind's eye, I may be making this part up, but I almost think I can remember Empman pawing the ground like a bull. I don't know if he was or not, but it sure felt. And George Mala'ulu comes to the line of scrimmage, and looks at Entman and turns over to Dick Tomey, the head coach, and says, "Time out." He said, "We are going to have to do something about this guy, and we've got to do it right now.
Yeah.
Or I'm going to die out here."
Yeah.
And it just, that and Entman, it's one of several things. Like I just never thought. Most of the guys who played with Steve would tell you they thought that was his best game ever. He just was so focused. And that's saying something because he had a lot of other great games.
Oh,
and
yeah.
He was a guy that commanded double and sometimes triple teams, and that allowed all these other guys to be great. And but I thought, and that photo, it's funny, when I first pitched this book to UW Press, I already had this photo in mind.
Yeah.
And it was, and the interesting thing about it is, so it's the Seattle Times' property.
Yeah.
And we contacted them, and so we negotiated, and we get a price set to buy the photo. Let me back up. Steve Entman was very cordial with me, but he did not want to talk to me about the book. And he says, "Look, I just don't like talking about the past." It was really crushing to me, and I worked and worked and worked, and he just went. Finally, you go, "Okay, I get it." And he was nice about it. He wasn't a jerk, but he just didn't want to do it. So now we're about a week away from D-Day, from the deadline.
Yeah.
And everything's set. And I get a call from the Seattle Times, and they said, "Our lawyers tell us that since this is the cover photo, you have to get Steve Entman's permission." And I'm like, you gotta be kidding me. So I call our publisher. I said, "To hell with that." They're going, "Hey, you're not in radio anymore. We actually do things legally here." I'm like,
lawyers.
Right. Lawyer. Yeah, now we got lawyers involved. So what are we going to do? So I emailed Steve, and I said, "I've got a gigantic favor to ask of you." And he got back to me within about 10 minutes. He said, "I'd be thrilled if you'd use that photo. Who do I need to contact?"
That's terrific.
So within an hour, I went from thinking, I can't even get this guy to call me, to he stepped up and delivered, because that's the only photo I wanted. There were a couple other backups, and then there was some thought of putting Don on the cover, and Don would have been great. Don also would have been the first guy to tell you, put a player on the cover.
Yeah.
Don't put the coach.
Yeah.
And if there's a photo that exemplifies the joy of being a young athlete more than that one does. Now, George Malauulu and his family might
say otherwise.
Might say no, but just he's young. His belly is flat. His fingers are in the air. He's unstoppable out there.
He's got this whoop going. You can see it through his face mask. It's a terrific photo.
I love that, and I think it helps sell a lot of the book. And Steve was, he was the guy. He was the most dominant college football player I ever saw.
Yeah.
He should have. If this had happened 5 years later, he'd have won the Heisman.
Yeah.
People just weren't wired yet to give the Heisman.
The defense.
And now we've kind of gone back to we only give the Heisman to a quarterback, which is ridiculous. He was the best player in college football that year, and he proved it. He proved it against Arizona that day. He proved it at Nebraska. He proved it against Nebraska in the Rose Bowl, or against Michigan in the Rose Bowl.
Yes.
He proved it at Cal, all top 10 teams.
Yep.
Again and again and again. He was unstoppable. He was simply a guy you had to account for him on every play, but it didn't matter. Dick Tomey, there's a great story in there at halftime of that Arizona game. They're down, I think it's 31-0 maybe, and Tomey, they're talking, and Tomey comes up, and he told this story himself, and I had another person verified who was in the room. He comes up and he draws out the X's and O's to talk to his team. Says, "Okay, fellas, we're getting beat, but we're going to do some things in the second half." And he goes, "Now here's what we're going to do." And there's a pause. And he's talking to his whole offense. And finally he turns around and says, "Guys, I'm not going to lie to you. I don't have any idea." This is Dick Tomey, who would go on the next couple of years to create a powerhouse in Arizona. And had great success. He goes, "I'm not going to lie to you. I'm going to treat you with dignity. I don't have any idea what we can do with these guys.
don't have a solution." Yeah.
And they'd have lost. I mean, if Don had been a different guy, this team would have won games 75 and 85 and 95. Maybe not 95, but they'd have scored, a ton. One of Don's proudest things in his career was he never scored more than 60 points. 58 points that year. They beat Oregon State 58-3, I think. It's the highest point total he ever scored. He said, it's a great line, and whenever you see coaches running it up now, I think, Don goes, "Hey, there comes a time in a game where you've proven your point."
That's for sure.
And you all you're doing now is just rubbing their noses in it. Now, if Don had been wired differently, guys would have stayed in longer. Mario Bailey's one of the great receivers of all time in college football. He played the fourth quarter in like 3 games this season in 91.
Yeah.
So Don just wasn't going to run up the score against anybody.
Yeah.
He just wasn't going to do it.
Wow, that was a class act.
Yeah.
You mentioned Mario Bailey, and we got to talk about the Heisman pose.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
That's a great story in this book.
It was fun, and Mario doesn't love talking about it. He will. He realizes he was kind of defined by that a little bit. And it's an interesting and somewhat complex story, but it probably got its genesis the week of the Rose Bowl. And they're doing a bunch of events with Michigan. Mario Bailey had spent all year as a huge Desmond Howard fan.
Yes.
He loved him.
We got to remind listeners that Desmond Howard was the Heisman winner that year.
And had done, Desmond Howard, one of the great moments in college football history, against Ohio State, returns a punt for a touchdown and bounces up in the end zone and strikes the Heisman post before he's won the Heisman.
Right.
And it's iconic. It's like, what a cool thing to have done. What a great, great, cool thing to do.
Yes.
So Desmond Howard's done this. Mario Bailey thinks he's the greatest. So this guy, and because there was some talk that Mario should have gotten a Heisman consideration. He goes, no, Desmond returned kicks and returned punts, and I didn't. Yeah. He deserved it. Yeah. So at a couple of the events in the 10 days leading up to the Rose Bowl, Mario walked over to Desmond Howard, and Desmond Howard wouldn't give him the time of day. And probably crushed is a little too much, but you meet somebody who you consider, a peer and an idol.
Yeah.
And they're a jerk to you.
Yeah, he wasn't gracious in a bit.
And then in an ESPN interview or in an interview with reporters, Howard's asked about Mario Bailey, and he says, I really don't know him.
Yeah.
And he goes, did he return punts and kickoffs? I don't know him. And that it ticked Mario Bailey off. That this guy who he had watched all year because Michigan was always on TV before the Huskies.
Oh, no doubt.
So he'd watch them, and then the Huskies would go play, and he's, this guy's the greatest. I can't wait to meet him. And it turns out it's a huge disappointment. And so, and earlier in the game, Walter Bailey, the cornerback, gets an interception, and he jumps up and does a real quick Heisman pose. And Bob Greasy even mentions it on the broadcast. Was that the Heisman pose we saw? Well, then Mario catches the ball from Mark Brunell in the fourth quarter in the end zone and pops up, and he didn't do a quick one. He held it. He held that pose. There's not a great photo of it, interestingly enough, but he held that pose long, and the sideline, guys said our sideline, nothing happened all year to make the sideline explode the way we did after that, because they all were on his side. Like, how dare you talk about him like he's nothing? And boy, there's some question as to whether or not Mario caught the ball. Fortunately, we were in the days before replay, so it didn't matter.
Right.
Mario says, he goes, I caught it. He goes, I caught it, and here's the primary reason I caught it. If I had thought there was any doubt about me catching it, I wouldn't have done the Heisman pose.
I wouldn't have popped up and done the Heisman pose. Absolutely.
I knew I had it. I knew it was a touchdown. He does the Heisman pose. He did it properly, too. I forget which arm it is.
Left arm.
Desmond did the wrong way.
Right.
Desmond put the wrong arm out for the statue, and Mario got it right, so he got the pose right. And it did lead. I'll give Desmond his props. And I mean, look, when you're 22, you say and do things maybe that you'd like to rethink. And I don't think Desmond Howard's a bad guy for this. He just added unnecessary fuel to Washington's fire. But his line after the game is one of my favorite all-time quotes, because Michigan gets their tails kicked to the point that the exclamation point is a guy mocking you with the Heisman pose.
And by the way, this is January 1, 1992 at the Rose Bowl.
Rose Bowl. It's the game, the granddaddy of them all. And after the game, somebody, and Howard I don't think saw it. He was on the sideline. Very possible you could have missed it. And says, oh, he did that? And he smiles, says, tell him if he wants to see the real one, he can come over to my house, which I thought was a great, great line.
Yeah.
I mean, Desmond didn't have much to fire at that point. That's a pretty good comeback. Yeah. That's not bad.
Yeah. Oh, that's good. Well, you mentioned, Mario Bailey caught the pass from Mark Brunell, but Mark Brunell didn't play that whole season.
Yeah.
And we got to talk about that a little bit, too.
Yeah, that's the injury he suffers in the spring, devastating knee injury that they thought was going to keep him out for the whole year.
Yeah. He's
going to be the guy. Mark Brunell is going to be the quarterback. And instead, this young, inexperienced, cocky, non-Don James player at the top of the list of people you wouldn't think Don James had won around, except he was a winner, and Don knew that. Here comes Billy Joe Hobart.
Yep.
And the players were a little divided. Some admitted 30 years later, I was a little unsure whether this guy would handle it. But others, Mario was one of them, said, no, we had seen him, and we knew what he was like in practice, and we knew he was a goof-off, but we all kind of thought if the spotlight, if he's ever in the slot, he's going to be ready to go, and that's exactly what he was. And so Brunell suffers just a freak injury in
practice
in spring ball.
Yeah.
And now here's this team that's going to be one of the favorites to contend for the national championship, and they're going to use a quarterback who had very little experience.
And by the way, before we leave the Brunell injury, it's a couple of the guys on the defense that are amped up in practice in spring ball. That didn't really certainly didn't intend to take down Mark Brunell and injure his knee, but part of the reason, we talked about how the defense in those days was just uncorked.
It was Donald Jones and Steve Entman, and they just both got to Mark, and Mark had a gold jersey on or a white, whatever jersey he had on. You weren't supposed to hit him, but he just
thought
and
that
the
was
offense,
protection.
The offense had been smoking the defense that day, and Lambeau and Randy Hart are just apoplectic yelling at these guys. And Randy told me, and Jim did too, I got to talk to Jim for a couple of times before he passed away. He never saw the book, unfortunately, but in the run-up to the book, they both said it was an expensive price to pay, but we learned a little bit about how to practice that day, that these guys didn't need their motors wound up. Yeah. That they learned a little about the team, like, all right, and Gilby was sideways about it.
I'll bet.
It's his quarterback. Like, what are you guys doing? Gilby, his quote was, I wanted to kill somebody, I just didn't know who.
Yeah.
So that injury was, and then Brunell, the other thing that the guy said was, we knew Brunell. We knew how hard he'd work. We knew he wasn't going to be out for the year.
Yeah.
And he gets back by the fourth game. But Don, and again, open to new experiences. Don James always said, you don't lose your position to an injury.
Yeah.
So in theory, Brunell should have been the quarterback, but by then they're 4-0, and they've beaten
Billy
Nebraska.
Joe train has left the station.
Billy Joe train's left the station, and Don's like, you know what, we're not going to dink around with this. We'll play Brunell. And I thought it was really cool. Gilby went to Brunell and said, here's the score. Billy is the starter, and again, Gilby said, but we are going to get you meaningful snaps.
Yeah.
And Don came from a day and age when generally more than one guy played the quarterback position. So to him, he used to laugh at the writers. He says, you guys make a big deal out of this. He goes, we put Brunell in the second quarter because he's good. It's no different from any other position. We give Billy a chance to rest and refocus a little bit. Mark will get. So they gave Brunell, but it's interesting. They promised Brunell meaningful snaps, but in the biggest games, with the Rose Bowl, a notable exception, but in the Nebraska game, in the Cal game, Brunell comes in for a couple of plays because Billy had a stinger. But for the most part, Billy was the guy. That's who they were living or dying with out there, and they lived. They 12-0.
Yeah. Well, and you talk about in the book, Billy Joe Hobart maybe wasn't a Don James type player, but there's an anecdote that I remember you telling about. He'd be in an away hotel and wouldn't be able to sleep in the middle of the night, and he'd walk down the hall, go down the stairs, walk back the other hall, the floor below, and go back up the stairs and just do this circle, focusing on the upcoming game the whole night.
Yeah, he tried everything to sleep, and he said, I wasn't nervous, but I just couldn't sleep.
Keyed up.
So by about and they'd stay in a hotel before every game. Even if they're in Seattle, they'd get, the old idea, coach has to have his team together the night before the big game.
Sure.
So we're going to put him in a hotel, and he would leave his room and he would call plays in his mind and think, all right, 3rd and 4, which play are we going to use? And he'd just walk. And the writers, who often were staying at the same hotel, and the broadcasters, who have no curfew, would bump into him as they're stumbling home from wherever they've been all night. So Billy technically was violating curfew by being out of his room, but he wasn't running out and partying. He was just running over plays and situations, and here's what we're going. I don't think it was quite all night, but he'd do it for a couple hours until his brain would finally be tired enough
get a few hours
get
sleep.
a little sleep. Yeah. That's a neat story about him and his.
It stuck with me.
Yeah, because you wouldn't have thought that with him. He had the Joe Namath stuff. See,
Right.
Namath is funny because you compare Billy to Joe. Oh, they're just these guys. They could stay out. They could party all night and chase girls, then go out and throw 5 touchdowns. Namath and Billy Joe had one thing in common. They were students of the game. They loved football.
Yeah.
And they also loved a good party.
Sure.
But they were able to do both. And Billy was good at that. Was very good at studying the game and knowing what was going to happen.
Yeah.
And Billy, and a couple of the offensive linemen told me this story. I can't remember if Billy wouldn't confirm it or didn't want to, or maybe he did. It's been a while since I did all this, but they were pretty good sports, but they also knew they were better than most. So they'd be in the fourth quarter just belting some team. And they'd come to the line of scrimmage, and Billy would yell at the defense, "Here's what we're going to do." He'd tell them the play, basically. And then they'd run it. He goes, "I'm telling you what we're going to do, and you still can't stop us." It said there was, they had, as Gilby put it, they had a lot of cocky championship guys.
Yes.
Guys who knew how to win and knew what winning was about.
Yeah. And all this came together for this one magic season. And, on the coaching staff and among the players, and we had a whole lot of skilled players we haven't talked about either.
Sure,
But that's the thing. That's another thing I think that comes through in your book is, it's not just like it came together magically. There's a certain amount of luck that went into all of it.
Absolutely.
But there was a lot of planning and a lot of hard work that went into this season.
You got to have the planning. You got to have the hard work. And some fans get really angry about this, but you've got to have luck. You have to. You can't find a championship team in any sport that hasn't had an element of luck at some point. And so a lot of it did come together, and the amount of talent they had, the willingness to listen to each other. They did a great job of holding each other accountable. Don would tell me that, they were his favorite team because one of his favorites, he had a couple that he really liked, because he never had to do anything in terms of discipline.
Yeah.
Steve Entman was your disciplinarian, or guys on offense. I mean, maybe I'm trying to think of who, there were guys certainly, like a Lincoln Kennedy type. Here's how we do things, guys. This is, Bob Rondo, the voice of the Huskies, gives me a great quote about, there are certain guys that lead verbally, and there's other guys who lead by example. And then he goes, and then there's Entman, and his idea of leadership was play like I play or I'll kill you. and that's kind of how it was. You were expected to always play at a certain level.
Yeah.
Matter of fact, the day Brunell gets hurt, that same day, there's a drive where the offense just walks down the field on the defense. And Entman calls the defense over to the sideline. He took his helmet and swung it in an arc and smashed it. First of all, he threw a bench out of the way. He threw one of these big benches, just threw it out of the way, and took his helmet and smashed an equipment cart. And you hear it all over Husky Stadium. And everybody jumped like, what was that? And he yelled ones over here. He meant the defensive starters, the defensive ones over here. And he just, in about a minute, explained to him that your play right now is unacceptable. And it's unacceptable here, it's unacceptable tomorrow, and it's certainly unacceptable in a game. Yeah. You will not play this way. We will not. And it's about 2 or 3 minutes after that Brunell, they were so wound. The coaches now are winding them up even more. And I said we can let the players wind themselves up.
Yeah.
We don't have to do it. That's the leadership that came from within. And that comes through in the Nebraska game too, where they're done, man. They're down by 2 touchdowns in the fourth quarter at Nebraska against an option team. You're not going to get the ball back enough, and and they somehow find a way to win that game. And it was, it's of all things, it's your 19-year-old quarterback walking up down the sideline saying, "Plenty of time, boys, plenty of time. We're going to win this game." And I think it was maybe Beano Bryant. I can't remember who says, I wanted to strangle him. Do you know where we are? Look at the scoreboard.
Yeah.
But and Mario Bailey was also, nope, he's right. We're going to win this game. And that's, again, cocky championship guys. We're down by 2 touchdowns at Nebraska. We're going to win the game.
We're going to win the game. Tremendous.
Yeah.
Tremendous season. we haven't talked about, and you intentionally in your book don't focus on this a lot, but after this magnificent season, there's some controversy.
Yeah.
Some of it involving Billy Joe Hobart.
Yeah.
I feel like we ought to touch on that a little bit in our podcast here.
Yeah, absolutely. And I wrote about it in the foreword. I chose to ignore it in the book. I wrote about it for a couple of paragraphs in the foreword. I didn't want to make it the focus. I wanted to make the focus of this book the joyousness of that season. And for the younger people enjoying today's podcast, there was a day and age where you couldn't pay players. And
Good point.
Billy Joe Hobart took basically, and a lot of guys did this, Billy Joe got caught, took a loan from like a friend, some friend of his father, loaned Billy $50,000 based on future Pearl earnings.
Yep.
Which was a pretty, and I don't know if there was interest I can't remember all the story, but Billy, and he blew through the cash pretty quick and then borrowed some more, and people noticed all of a sudden he was driving a nicer car, and eventually, it came out, and then there were a bunch of other smaller things where the Huskies had gotten a little careless with some of the rules that they were following. One of them involves when recruits were in town, they would provide them in their hotel with a fruit basket, which was against NCAA rules, because God knows we don't want young athletes consuming fruit. So all of that came down. It ultimately led to Don resigning, and he felt he was very upset with the president, Bill Gerberding, for not backing him. Again, it's such – and Sam Farmer, a guy who's a writer in L.A. now for the Los Angeles Times, Sam was a writer up here for one of the 7 daily newspapers who covered the Huskies in 1991, back in the day. Sam wrote a book called Bitter Roses.
Yeah.
And that's the other reason I didn't really delve into this too much, is Sam's book is terrific, and if you're into that story, you will get all the details. I couldn't have done it any better, and why rehash something that Sam, who's a great writer, has already hashed? Why should I rehash it?
Yeah.
So that's the primary reason, I stayed away from it. And I also kind of put myself in the mind of a 1991 person.
Yeah.
They didn't know any of this was going on.
That's right.
And a lot of it happened after the 91 season. But again, hey, they broke rules and they got caught, and they paid a draconian price. It's the only time I can ever remember. The Pac-10 was so into, we discipline our own, we're tougher. And the Pac-10 issued penalties. It was like 2 years of a TV ban, 2 years of a bowl ban, all these scholarships lost, and all of that got minimized by the NCAA, who of all people said to the Pac-10, "You're being too tough.
Yeah.
You've gone way too far with
Wow.
even we wouldn't do you." The NCAA was the voice of reason on this, which is kind of amazing.
Yeah.
So again, it's another story altogether. I explained in the foreword why I didn't go into it too much, and people can choose. People can choose to go either way on it, but I can't. If you're into that part of the story and you've forgotten about things, Sam Farmer's book is still out there, and it's terrific.
Yeah. Excellent read. You talked a little bit about the joy of, you wanted to focus on the joy, and part of that comes, and I got a kick out of this in your book too. The foreword, I guess, is a quote from Fielding Yost from a 1905 book called Football for Player and Spectator. And that was delightful. But you kind of finish up the book, but just before the epilogue, with another quotation from Fielding Yost. And I got a kick out of this when I was recording the book. Here's what he said. This is 1905. Let us start homeward. This is after a successful game. Let us start homeward. It is time for us to prepare for the festivities of the evening. There will be lively times around the old campus tonight. I just thought that was a delightful way to close this book, because
I love the writing of that era.
Yeah.
Fielding Yost, legendary coach, who one of the greatest coaches in Michigan history. And Don James coached at Michigan for a while. Didn't know Fielding Yost. Don wasn't quite that old, but knew people who knew him.
Yeah.
So there was a little bit of a connection there. And I love how writing has evolved, and how you can, there's a thing when they play at Nebraska. I found an old ad for the Cornhusker Hotel, which is where Don James had stayed when he was the captain and quarterback of the Miami team in 1953. They played at Nebraska, and it was called The Host to the Most. And the ad said, TVs available upon request in every room.
How about that?
And then Fielding Yost talking about it'll be a lively time on the old campus. As I understand it, beer had been invented, and as I also understand it, college kids like drinking beer. So in 1905, when you won a football game, or in 2024, when you win a football game, there'll be lively times on the campus that night.
Well, that's the thing, and the joy of this season really comes through this book.
I appreciate that.
I enjoyed it very much. I enjoyed having the opportunity to record it. I hope listeners will have the opportunity to listen to it, or if they're able to, get out and get a copy and read it. Is there anything else, Mike, that strikes you from the season or from the book that we haven't covered that you'd really like to say?
Just how gracious everyone was with time. I'm writing a book about something that happened 30 years ago. And a couple, just everybody was so generous with their time and with their memories. I mentioned that, I wish Don James was here. Not the least of reasons is to read this book, but I wish he was here for his family and for Carol, who misses him dearly. The only thing about him not being here was I think it opened guys up to maybe telling stories that they might not. Dick Barrett, he's like, I don't know if I should tell this. Don might be mad. Don's been gone for a while. And so there's the great story of Don, who was not a big drinker. I mean, wasn't even a little drinker, but he wasn't a teetotaler. And he and Dick are in a small private plane going through a thunderstorm, coming home from a recruiting thing, and the pilot says there's a bottle of whiskey under the seat, and they pull it out, and Don takes a sip. Don was a nervous flyer anyway. Now he's in a small plane in a storm, so he takes a big belt of it to calm his nerves and hands it to Dick, and Dick says, no thanks, I don't drink whiskey. And Don's like, you don't. Dick is a world-class imbiber. And he goes, you don't drink whiskey? He goes, you drink everything else. And Dick goes, I just don't drink whiskey.
Yeah.
So those were stories that, and Don, I actually ran that one by Carol. And she said, oh, Don would think that's a great story. Because I didn't ask Carol's permission, but I did want her to know. And she goes, oh, that Don had people, if anything, she said something interesting to me, and I wish I'd put this in the book. If anything, Don got frustrated with the holier-than-thou image that people created for him. They think, no, I am not perfect. I don't, I'm not the perfect person here. And so I think that we showed a couple of his vulnerabilities in this book while still portraying him as the great leader he was. And that was kind of a cool thing maybe to think about. He asked about other things. Just being able to, again, I mentioned earlier, Gilby and Lambeau and Baird, being able to ram home again what this great man Don James did in this community and why there's a statue of him outside the stadium and why he'll be revered around these parts forever because he was great at his job. He was really, really great at his job.
That absolutely comes through in the book. Another thing that came through to me is you don't think of Don James as being a funny guy,
right,
or a character, but one of the anecdotes that you said has to do with Hobart telling reporters after the Cal game that the UW offense deserved to grade a C-. Yeah. And then one of the reporters asked Don James about it. He said, well, I disagree with Billy on that, and I explained to him why this morning several of our guys played A or at worst A- games. And then he gets the question, what about your quarterback? What about Billy Joe Hobart? How was this game? Don James says he gets a C-.
He recognized in Billy the wild Mustang that he had, but he knew he had to dig the spurs in once in a while.
That's right.
And Billy, to his credit, said, whenever Don, talked to me about stuff like that, I really listened, and I never thought, oh, this old guy, he's just not letting me be me. I mean, Billy had, and this was a neat story. I didn't know this. Everybody remembers that Billy at one point said, that Miami was having a great season as Washington was, and ended up 12-0, and they won the Writers' National Championship. The Huskies won the coaches. There was some thought that Miami and Washington should play, but they couldn't. Contractually, they were obligated to go to the Bowls. And Billy said, we should dog the Rose Bowl and go play Miami. And I can't remember if Don said to him, you see, the Rose Bowl's pretty traditional. You shouldn't do that. Billy on his own the week of the Rose Bowl found the chairman of the Tournament of Roses and said, I'm really sorry I said that. I just want to play Miami, but I didn't mean to harm your game. And Billy was a deep and complex, is a deep and complex guy. But man, oh man, was he a winner. 19-0 as a starter at the University of Washington. 19-0. They felt like with him in control, they were going to win, and they did.
Just an amazing team, an amazing season, and I have to say, a terrific book brings all that together.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Bob. I appreciate that.
The book again is Fear No Man, Don James, the 91 Huskies, and the 7-year quest for a national football championship by Mike Gastineau. Mike, thanks so much for being here today.
I love, as you can tell, talking about this and telling this story. And Bob, I appreciate the time. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Mike Gastineau's book, Fear No Man, on Don James, the 91 Huskies, and the 7-year quest for a national football championship, is in the catalog of the Washington Talking Book and Braille Library. It's available as an audiobook with the class ID DBC 19355. If you have any questions or comments about the library, or to see if you're qualified for our services, visit WTBBL.org or call us Monday through Friday from 8:30 a.m. to 5:30 p.m. at 206-615-0400 or toll free at 800-542-0866. Literary Notes is a production of the Washington Talking Book and Braille Library, based in Seattle, Washington. This episode's interview was conducted by volunteer Bob Carlson. I'm your producer, Nathan Ureta. Thanks for listening.